It began like any ordinary Sunday at New Hope Ministries. The morning air carried the gentle hum of church bells, inviting the faithful to gather. Inside, rows of worshipers filled the pews, their voices rising together in hymns of devotion. Pastor James Reynolds stood at the altar, the familiar sight of his open Bible resting in front of him, his voice steady and calm as he prepared to deliver his sermon. To the congregation, this was their place of peace, their sanctuary. But what unfolded next would shatter that peace forever. The sound of a gunshot rang out, cutting through the hymns like a knife. Screams echoed as chaos erupted. Pastor Reynolds collapsed to the ground, blood staining the altar where he had stood moments earlier. The congregation could only watch in stunned horror as the shooter revealed herself, a woman whose ties to the pastor ran far deeper than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of Pastor James Reynolds, a man revered by his community, entangled in a web of betrayal that would lead to a crime no one saw coming. What secrets led to that fateful moment? And how did a house of worship become the stage for an unimaginable act of violence? In the heart of Fairhaven, a quaint town where life moved at a pace dictated by tradition, Pastor James Reynolds was more than just a preacher. He was a cornerstone. Known for his magnetic sermons and unwavering dedication to his community, James was the man people turned to in moments of despair, the voice of reason during life's most challenging storms. To the outside world, his life seemed a testament to faith and purpose. But as the saying goes, even the brightest lights cast shadows. Standing by his side was Elaine Reynolds, his devoted wife of 20 years. Elaine wasn't just the pastor's wife. She was a pillar in her own right, leading prayer groups, organizing community events, and embodying the quiet strength the congregation admired. Together, they seemed inseparable, a beacon of hope for the church they nurtured. But relationships, even the strongest ones, are never immune to strain. Years before that fateful Sunday, there was Cassandra Morgan. Once a vibrant member of the church choir, Cassandra was a presence that could not be ignored. Her voice carried through the sanctuary, filling the air with something almost transcendent. But her connection to Pastor Reynolds extended beyond the choir rehearsals. What began as moments of mentorship and spiritual guidance grew into something more, a relationship that crossed boundaries no one could have anticipated. Their affair was brief, but consequential. When Cassandra became pregnant, the weight of their choices became unavoidable. James, faced with the collapse of his carefully curated life, chose to end the relationship, cutting ties with Cassandra in a bid to salvage his marriage and reputation. He returned to Elaine, seeking forgiveness and vowing to rebuild what had been broken. For a time, it seemed as though the past had been buried. But Cassandra never truly disappeared from James's life. Co-parenting their child meant that their paths continued to intersect, creating an undercurrent of unresolved tension. While James worked tirelessly to maintain his image as a man of faith and integrity, Cassandra's presence lingered like an unwelcome echo, reminding him of a chapter he could never fully close. As James stood before his congregation week after week, delivering sermons about redemption and forgiveness, another story was unfolding in the background. A story of heartbreak, resentment, and the quiet simmer of emotions left unchecked. The church saw a man of God. Cassandra saw something else entirely. A man who had betrayed her, denied their connection, and moved on without a second glance. For her, forgiveness was not an option. While Pastor James Reynolds stood at the pulpit delivering messages of hope and redemption, his personal life was anything but serene. Beyond the church doors, a storm was gathering, one that would soon engulf everyone in its path. For Cassandra Morgan, life after the affair had been anything but fair. Left to raise their child largely on her own, she found herself embroiled in endless financial disputes with James. He provided the bare minimum, citing church obligations and personal responsibilities. But to Cassandra, it felt like an intentional dismissal, another way to erase her from his carefully controlled life. Resentment began to fester, a quiet rage that grew with every unmet promise, every reminder of the life James had built without her. And then there was the public facade, the image of the Reynolds family, perfectly intact and unwavering. Sundays at New Hope Ministries were a showcase of unity, with James and Elaine presenting themselves as a couple stronger than ever. For Cassandra, these displays were a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder of her exclusion. She was the secret, the footnote in James's otherwise spotless narrative. At first, her frustrations were expressed through subtle digs during conversations about their child, a tone sharp enough to cut, but not enough to alarm. But as time went on, subtlety gave way to something far more alarming. Cassandra began sending messages, long accusatory texts that shifted between anger and desperation. "You'll regret this," one message read, followed by another. "You don't get to walk away like I never existed." James tried to dismiss the messages, brushing them off as the emotional outbursts of someone still bitter about the past. He confided in Elaine, who urged him to set boundaries and focus on their family. But the messages didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, more erratic. Cassandra began showing up at the church unannounced, lingering in the parking lot or sitting at the back of the sanctuary, her eyes fixed on James during every sermon. The congregation noticed her presence but dismissed it as the actions of a devoted member. To James, it was anything but. One confrontation stands out. After a midweek service, Cassandra waited for James in the church parking lot. Witnesses recall raised voices and sharp gestures, a heated exchange that ended with Cassandra storming off, muttering words no one could quite make out. But it was clear, this wasn't just a custody dispute or lingering bitterness. Something had shifted. The tension between them had grown too big to contain, and those closest to the situation began to sense that it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. But James, ever the optimist, believed he could manage the situation. He had handled crises before, marital issues, financial setbacks, even moments of doubt in his own faith. This was just another challenge to overcome. What he didn't realize was that Cassandra wasn't simply venting her frustrations. She was making a plan. Sunday morning at New Hope Ministries was the heartbeat of the week for many in this quiet community. The pews were filled with familiar faces, families, couples, and devoted members of the congregation, all eager to hear Pastor James Reynolds deliver his sermon. The sound of the choir warming up blended harmoniously with the rustling of hymnals and whispered greetings. For those in attendance, it was a moment of peace, a chance to connect with their faith and one another. But no one could have imagined how drastically their world was about to change. James stepped up to the pulpit with his characteristic poise. Dressed in a crisp suit, his voice was steady, his message uplifting. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the power of faith to overcome adversity. The congregation hung on his every word, nodding along, their trust in him unwavering. It was a scene of calm and unity, the very essence of what New Hope Ministries stood for. Unnoticed by most, the church doors opened midway through the sermon. A figure slipped quietly into the back row, blending into the shadows of the dimly lit sanctuary. Cassandra Morgan had arrived. She wore a neutral expression, her face betraying nothing of the storm within. Few paid her any attention. After all, Cassandra was no stranger to the church. Her presence hardly seemed out of place. But there was something different about her this time, something those who saw her later struggled to describe. As James continued speaking, Cassandra remained still, her eyes fixed on him. Her hands rested in her lap, one clutching a handbag that seemed almost too large for the occasion. To those seated nearby, she appeared calm, even composed. But beneath that exterior, an entirely different reality was unfolding. The minutes ticked by. James moved through his sermon, his voice filling the sanctuary with words of hope and encouragement. The choir behind him shifted slightly, readying themselves for the next hymn. A child whispered to their mother in the third row, drawing a soft shush. Everything about the scene was routine, ordinary. But that ordinary moment would soon shatter into chaos. At exactly 11:22 a.m., the tone of the service changed. James paused briefly, looking out into the congregation as if sensing something was off. It was a fleeting moment, gone almost as quickly as it came. He resumed speaking, his voice steady once again. But Cassandra's movements broke the stillness. She stood, slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving James. For a moment, those around her assumed she was leaving, perhaps stepping out for a moment. But instead, she reached into her handbag. What happened next was described by witnesses as surreal, a blur of motion, a collective gasp, and then the sound that would forever mark that day. A deafening crack echoed through the sanctuary, silencing every voice, every movement. It took a moment for those present to comprehend what they had just witnessed. James Reynolds, the man they looked to for guidance and faith, had collapsed at the foot of the altar. Screams erupted, filling the once serene space. Parents shielded their children, ushers scrambled toward the source of the commotion, and Elaine Reynolds, seated in the front row, froze in horror. The congregation erupted into chaos as Cassandra stood motionless, the gun still in her hand. Her expression was unreadable, her stance unwavering. It was as though time had stopped, the gravity of what had just occurred sinking in all at once. Amid the chaos, several members of the congregation rushed toward James, while others frantically dialed 911. Elaine dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands trembling as she called out his name. But James lay still, his blood pooling on the steps of the altar, a haunting contrast to the white cloth draped across it. Cassandra made no move to flee, no effort to explain or defend her actions. She simply stood there, waiting, as though this moment had been inevitable. The air in the church had been thick with reverence, but in a single terrible moment, that tranquility shattered beyond recognition. It was as if time itself held its breath, waiting for the storm to strike. The sound of the gunshot pierced the stillness with a force no one could have anticipated, a sound so jarring that it seemed to freeze the room. For those who had been witness to what unfolded, the horror would haunt them forever. Cassandra Morgan, once a beloved member of the church, a woman who had once stood beside Pastor James Reynolds singing hymns of faith, was now a figure of unimaginable devastation. Without warning, she rose from her seat, her movement fluid but unsettling. The eyes of the congregation remained fixed on their pastor, entranced by his words, unaware of the impending disaster. Then, the unthinkable. She walked toward the altar, her footsteps deliberate and heavy. The eyes of many still unaware of the threat that was walking among them. Cassandra's face remained calm, her steps unnervingly steady, but a coldness hung in the air, wrapping around the church like a dark cloud, thickening by the second. As she reached the altar, something caught the attention of those closest to her, her hand slowly moving toward her handbag. At first, no one knew what to expect, but within a split second, the truth became horribly clear. A gun, its metal surface gleaming under the soft church lights, emerged from her bag and was raised with deadly precision. The congregation gasped, some still in shock, others frozen in disbelief. Elaine Reynolds, who had been seated at the front, immediately recognized what was happening, her body stiffening in horror as her eyes locked onto the weapon now aimed at her husband. And in that instant, the world seemed to slow to a crawl. It was as if every breath was drawn too quickly, too sharply, knowing something horrific was about to unfold. Before anyone could react, before any word of warning could be uttered, the gunshot echoed through the sanctuary. The sound rang out in a deafening explosion, as if the very walls of the church itself had been torn apart. James Reynolds, the pillar of strength, the man who had guided so many with his words of wisdom and faith, collapsed in an instant, his body crumpling to the altar floor. His blood, stark and dark against the white linen cloth, spread out in widening pools. The congregation erupted into chaos, a cacophony of screams, cries of panic, and the sound of frantic footsteps as people scrambled for cover. Children clung to their parents, others ducked beneath the pews in sheer terror. It was impossible to understand what had just transpired, how this quiet Sunday morning had transformed into an unimaginable nightmare. Elaine, paralyzed with disbelief and anguish, knelt beside her husband, her hands desperately pressing against the wound in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Her voice trembled with disbelief, calling his name over and over. But it was no use. James was still, too still, and nothing could bring him back. In the midst of the chaos, Cassandra stood motionless. She didn't move, didn't speak. She was a figure frozen in time, her hand still gripping the weapon. Her eyes were fixed not on the damage she had done, but on the crowd around her, as if she had already detached herself from everything happening around her. It was only moments later when the sound of sirens pierced the air outside the church, their wail growing louder by the second. The doors to the sanctuary swung open and police officers rushed in, guns drawn. They didn't hesitate, immediately apprehending Cassandra, their movements swift and forceful. The weapon was taken from her hands and she was placed under arrest without a word. Still, she made no attempt to resist, her face blank, devoid of any emotion as she was led away. Outside the church, the flashing red and blue lights painted the building in an eerie glow, a contrast to the peaceful scene it had been only moments before. Officers swarmed the area, securing the perimeter and beginning their investigation. The town, which had once felt so safe and welcoming, was now marked by a tragedy that would forever change its future. And within the walls of New Hope Ministries, the sounds of chaos still echoed as the reality of what had just happened set in. The facts of the case are as stark and undeniable as the devastation they left behind. What occurred inside New Hope Ministries on that fateful Sunday would be etched into the memories of those who witnessed it, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. Let's take a step back and lay out what we know, what we can be certain of, based on the investigation and the statements of those who were there. The incident occurred on Sunday, June 13th at approximately 11:30 a.m. inside New Hope Ministries Church, a small but vibrant congregation in the heart of Maplewood, a quiet town where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. The church had been filled with regular parishioners that day, each person in their usual seat, expecting nothing more than another Sunday morning of worship. What they didn't expect was the storm that would suddenly engulf them, forever altering the fabric of their community. Witnesses recall the beginning of the service being just like any other. "The congregation was engaged," said Mary Lorne, a longtime member of the church. "Everyone was listening intently. The pastor was speaking about hope, renewal, and love. It was a beautiful message." For those few minutes, the peaceful atmosphere seemed like it could last forever. But behind the calm, tension was rising. It was Cassandra Morgan's sudden arrival that began to unsettle the room. "I remember looking up and seeing her walk in," said Reverend Carla Henry, an assistant pastor who was present that morning. She wasn't supposed to be there. It felt off, but nobody knew exactly why. No one, not even the closest friends of Pastor James, realized the extent of the tension between him and Cassandra. She was a figure from his past, and that history had far from been laid to rest. What we know from the evidence is that Cassandra had not only been a former member of the church's choir, but also a woman with whom Pastor James had once shared a deeply personal relationship. According to several sources, their affair had ended years ago, and James had worked hard to move forward with his family, especially after he reconciled with his wife, Elaine. But it's clear now that Cassandra struggled to let go. In the days leading up to the tragedy, the tension between them was palpable. Text messages between James and Cassandra reveal an ongoing struggle over child support for their son, a reminder of the relationship that had once been. But the exchange went beyond money. There were frequent confrontations, each one tinged with escalating bitterness. At approximately 11:37 a.m., the calm atmosphere shattered. Cassandra walked down the aisle with the kind of focus that could not be ignored. She approached the altar and without hesitation drew a gun from her bag. The first shot rang out with horrific clarity, catching everyone in the church off guard. "I didn't even understand what had happened," said Derek Wilson, a church usher who had been sitting near the back. "There was this awful sound, and then everything just erupted into chaos." The congregation, who had once been worshiping with hearts open, now found themselves scrambling for their lives, shouting, screaming, people ducking for cover, desperate to escape the horror that was unfolding. James Reynolds was struck in the chest, collapsing to the altar in front of his wife and an entire congregation of witnesses. As the chaos unfurled, the emergency response was swift. Police arrived on the scene within minutes, taking control of the situation and arresting Cassandra Morgan without incident. She was found in a state of shock, her face as empty as the gunshot wound that had taken James's life. The investigation into the shooting was thorough and meticulous. Police recovered the weapon, a Glock 19 handgun, from the scene. Forensic analysis showed that the gun had been legally purchased under Cassandra's name, though she had no prior criminal record. A search of her personal effects revealed notes, letters, and other items that indicated a deep emotional struggle, some directed toward James, others toward his wife, Elaine. These were not the actions of a woman who had merely come to the church to confront her past. This was a premeditated act, one fueled by a dark and obsessive fixation. On June 15th, 2 days after the incident, Cassandra Morgan was charged with first-degree murder. Her trial would soon follow, but before any legal proceedings began, the town of Maplewood was already in shock. Questions arose not just about her actions, but about what might have led her to this point. How had this woman, someone who had once been a part of this community, become capable of such violence? In the days following the shocking murder, the reverberations of the violence were felt far beyond the cold walls of New Hope Ministries. For those who knew Pastor James Reynolds, the pain was overwhelming, not just because of his tragic death, but because of what it revealed. His wife, Elaine, and their tight-knit congregation now found themselves facing an unimaginable loss, one that would test their faith and understanding of everything they once believed. Elaine Reynolds, a woman who had stood by her husband through thick and thin, now found herself standing alone in a world where nothing seemed as it once had. The woman who had once been by his side, supporting him through every sermon, every prayer, was suddenly thrust into a reality she never prepared for. It wasn't just the loss of her husband. It was the loss of trust. The secrets, the betrayal, and the violence were too much to bear in the wake of his death. Elaine struggled to reconcile James's death with the truth she had uncovered in the aftermath. How could she have been blind to the pain he had hidden for so long? The weight of this realization crushed her. "I don't know how to move on from this," she whispered to close friends. "How do you let go of someone you loved yet never truly knew? And what of the congregation? The very people who had placed their trust in Pastor James for years. Many had seen him as more than a spiritual leader. They had seen him as a guiding figure, a man of unwavering faith. But now, they too were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered community. How could they worship in the same place where such a horrific act had unfolded? How could they trust again when the man they had once revered had carried with him a hidden past that no one could have imagined? Members of the congregation, once united under the same roof, now found themselves divided by the shadows of the truth. "We never saw this coming," said Janet Williams, a longtime church member. "I always thought I knew Pastor James. He was a father figure to many of us, and now we don't know who he really was. Who was he, really?" The questions swirled in the minds of the community, but no answers seemed to bring peace. The betrayal, the loss, it was a wound that was far too deep to heal easily. For days, the town of Maplewood fell into mourning, and the community could not escape the weight of the tragedy. The church, which had once been a sanctuary of peace, now felt hollow. Each step down the aisles echoed with the sounds of grief, as the people who once gathered for joyful worship now came to grieve together. Elaine's grief was visible to anyone who looked. She spent long hours at the church, sitting alone in the pews, her face a mask of sorrow. Her tears were not just for the loss of James, but for the life they had built together, now forever altered by the violence and deceit that had come to light. After the dust had settled, the small town of Maplewood held its breath. The terror that had consumed the community on that fateful Sunday had left a deep scar, but now it was time for justice to be served. The courtroom, once a place of legal proceedings, was about to witness the emotional unraveling of a story that had shattered the lives of so many. Cassandra Morgan, the woman responsible for Pastor James Reynolds' death, was no longer just the former choir member with a troubled past. Now, she was a defendant facing the consequences of her actions. Charged with second-degree murder, she stood in front of the court, her once confident demeanor now replaced with an unsettling quietness. It was clear that nothing could undo the damage she had done. The weight of the crime was heavy, and for many, it felt like justice would finally bring some semblance of peace to the community. But could anything truly erase the pain left behind? Cassandra pled guilty to second-degree murder, a decision that sent ripples through the town. She had once been a part of the church, a woman who had shared moments of worship and community with those who now mourned the loss of their beloved pastor. But now, her actions stood in stark contrast to everything the church had taught them about forgiveness and love. As she stood before the judge, her eyes remained fixed, and her plea was accepted. She would be sentenced to 25 years in prison. In the courtroom, the voices of those who had once trusted Cassandra spoke the loudest. Elaine Reynolds, a woman who had lost everything, took the stand and shared the depths of her grief. Her voice cracked as she spoke about the man she had loved, the father of her children, the pastor who had been taken from her in the most horrific of ways. "I don't know how to live in a world where he's not here," Elaine said, her words raw with pain. "But I can't forgive what she did. I can't forgive the way she tore apart our family, our community." Her words were met with a heavy silence. The room seemed to hold its breath as her words hung in the air, each syllable weighed down by sorrow and loss. Members of the congregation also took the stand, recounting the heartache they had witnessed in the aftermath of the murder. "Pastor James was more than a leader to us," said Maria Thompson, a longtime member of the church. "He was our friend, our guide, and now he's gone because of a decision she made. I don't know how we can ever heal from this." The courtroom filled with tension as people tried to make sense of a tragedy they couldn't comprehend. How could someone so closely entwined with their faith, someone who had once been a part of their family, bring such destruction? As the trial drew to a close, it was time for the judge to deliver the sentence. 25 years behind bars. It wasn't enough for some. How could it be? 25 years would never bring back the man who had led them, the man who had shaped their lives. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done, but it was at least the consequence of an irreversible act. As Cassandra was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, the community watched in silence. The pain of her actions would linger, and even as the gavel struck, the questions remained. Could anything ever truly make things right? As the gavel came down, marking the end of the trial, the small town of Maplewood was left to confront the devastation that had been wrought. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Pastor James Reynolds was gone, and his family, his congregation, and the very foundation of New Hope Ministries would never be the same. In the end, the trial offered no solace to those left behind, only the reminder that some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never truly heal. In the end, the story of Pastor James Reynolds, Elaine, and Cassandra leaves us with questions that may never be fully answered. How did a life filled with faith, community, and hope unravel into such heartbreak? Could anyone have seen the warning signs? And more importantly, could this tragedy have been prevented? Betrayal and unaddressed emotional pain can create a storm within us, a storm that can build over years, quietly shaping our actions until it finally erupts in ways no one could have imagined. For Cassandra, the weight of rejection, resentment, and desperation became too much to bear. But this story is not just about her or the choices she made that day. It's about the deeper truths that lie beneath, the emotions we ignore, the conflicts we leave unresolved, and the silent cries for help that often go unanswered. As a society, we are often taught to hide our pain, to endure in silence, and to believe that time alone will heal all wounds. But time without intervention often deepens those wounds. Cassandra's actions remind us of the devastating consequences that can arise when emotions fester unchecked. When there's no outlet for the pain, no one to listen, no one to help. Her story is not an excuse for her choices, but it serves as a cautionary tale. We must address conflict and pain before they grow into something far greater than we can control. For Elaine Reynolds, the journey of healing continues. She has shown us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, it is possible to turn grief into purpose. Her advocacy for victims of abuse and her commitment to forgiveness remind us of the strength and resilience of the human spirit. But healing shouldn't begin in the aftermath of tragedy. It must start much earlier. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges, feelings of isolation, or unresolved conflicts, this is the moment to reach out, to talk, to listen, to act. This story reminds us that unchecked emotions and unaddressed pain have the power to destroy lives, not just the lives of those involved, but the lives of everyone around them. As we reflect on what happened in Maplewood, we are left with one lingering question. What could have been done differently? And perhaps most importantly, how can we ensure that no one else faces a similar fate? Stories like these are more than just tales of heartbreak and tragedy. They're reminders of the fragile threads that connect us all. They urge us to reflect, to question, and to act. If this story has moved you, inspired you to think deeper, or opened your eyes to the complexities of human emotions, we invite you to join this journey with us. By liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to our channel, you become part of a community committed to uncovering real-life mysteries, true crime stories, and the lessons they hold. Every week, we bring you narratives that challenge, inform, and compel you to see the world in a different light. And now, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this tragedy? How do you think events like this can be prevented in the future? Your voice matters. Leave your insights in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can shed light on the darkest corners of human experience, and perhaps find the keys to understanding and prevention along the way.